it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our featured guest, author Sarah Stonich. Sarah's books have garnered numerous honors. Her first novel, These Granite Islands, won a Loft McKnight Award, a Friends of American Writers Award, and was a Barnes & Noble Great New Writers Pick. That novel was translated into 11 languages. Her second book, The Ice Chorus, was also widely translated. Her memoir, Shelter Off the Grid in the Mostly Magnetic North, won a Northeastern Minnesota Book Award. Sarah's trilogy, Fishing with Rayanne, which was written under the pen name Ava Finch, will be reissued in 2020 by the University of Minnesota Press. The first installment will be Fishing, and that will come out in March, and it will be followed in October by Reeling. And she's currently adapting that series for television as well as writing original screenplays. Sarah's Northern trilogy began with Vacationland, and this title has been chosen as a community read in 24 Midwestern and Canadian cities. The trilogy continued with Laurentian Divide, which won a 2019 Minnesota Book Award and a Northeastern Minnesota Book Award, and was selected by the National Women's Book Association to be a National Reading Group Month selection. And Sarah is currently at work on the final volume of that Northern trilogy called Watershed. Of her literary talents, Colin McCann says, "One of the joys of reading is coming across books in which language is perfectly wedded to story." And Richard Russo called her book, Laurentian Divide, hilarious, smart, moving and kind, and good for the soul. Sarah lives in Minneapolis on the Mississippi River in a renovated flour mill with her husband, musician John Weir. And we're so pleased that she's joined us today. So let's all give a warm welcome to Sarah Stonich.
I did not realize that Ramsey County had seven libraries that they support, which is pretty amazing. And they do such good work, and they're brilliant, and have ideas of asking people like me to come and be with you, and I'm so honored. So, reading season has begun a little bit early this year. Thank you, climate change. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my Northern trilogy that was mentioned. Thank you very much. And I started writing Vacationland several years ago, just as short stories. And I realized that there was a theme that was going on, and that they all kind of harkened back to this one particular place, which is called Naledi Lodge, which for me is real, but is actually fictional. My family is from Ely, Minnesota. I spent my summers there from probably age 2 onward. And until recently, I had my own place there. And about 5 years ago, we sold our little cabin. And I miss it terribly, but it still lives within me. And so I wrote Vacationland, never intending that it would be a trilogy. But when I finished, there were characters that I realized that I wasn't done with, and characters that maybe felt like they needed to be a little bit redeemed for me. Characters like Pete, who was, I know there's a lot of people here that read Vacationland. Can you raise your hands? Quite a few. So y'all know who Pete is. And so he was the boyfriend of Meg, who is the character that ties this book together. And he really needed to be redeemed a little bit. So I had to bring him back to life for Laurentian Divide. And his dad, Alpo. And now normally I don't read too much when I'm at these things, but I thought today, because it is reading season, that I would read a little bit from this book. There's a story called Navigation, and I have to actually look it up. Page 91, in case you're interested. There's characters that I miss. And Cassie and her mother, Ursa, are two of them. And they live on in other books. Cassie shows up in my Fishing with Rayanne trilogy that I wrote under the pen name of Ava Finch, which was mentioned is going to be reissued by the University of Minnesota Press next spring as Reeling. And Cassie is one of the many characters in Vacationland that lives a bigger life, and she goes on into other aspects of my writing. And so this is our introduction to Cassie and her grandmother, Ursa, who are two of my favorite characters from this book. Ursa, I think, because she's cranky, she's 93 years old, and she really doesn't give a damn anymore about what people think. And I can imagine myself becoming her because I'm getting low on patience. This is a teenage girl who has deliberately gotten herself lost in a bog. I don't know how much I'll read of it, but I'll go for as long as you can stand it. Each word makes a huff in the cold air. Words Cassie and her great-grandma, Banna, set down playing Scrabble the night before. Inhaling heft, exhaling cowl. She swings her arms to stay warm. In, out, hasp, pucker, quiz. Each word brings Cassie another step into the bog, from hump to hump of squelchy moss. Some words are less interesting in her mouth, like jerk or pant. The sounds they make, only what they are, boring onomatopoeia. Of all the three-letter words, she adores fez. Hokum was laid down for a triple, but Cassie's not sure what it means since Banna had only offered twaddle as a definition. She plans to consult the dictionary once she's back at the cabin. For now, she yells five-letter words at a trio of black spruce. Comic, pansy, vomit. Anything goes as long as it's in the dictionary. Cassie had hooted when laying the B in front of Banna's itch to narrow the gap in their scores. Cassie's mother, Era, grinding away at some countertop, only shook her head, but Gran Karina stopped stabbing forks into their drawer long enough to sigh, one of her colossal sighs saying, "Those two," which only made Cassie laugh louder and made Banna clack through her dentures. And those two think fun is scouring the chrome off of my taps. Cassie blinks at the soggy ground ahead, wondering if she's very far off the path and deciding, hopefully not much, maybe. Tamarack needles stick to the wires basting the earbuds to her iPod in her hip pocket. She turns up the volume and squeals along to Joanna Newsom. Svetlana sucks lemons across from me. She's a little thirsty herself. High above, a hawk wheels as if attached to a maypole. Hawk sounds more like something you'd cough up, Cassie decides. No name for something so eloquently aloft. Happy with that description, Cassie blinks one eye, then the other, her lips moving soundlessly until a haiku forms and whispers itself out. Swooping for breakfast, loop and pluck and swallow whole, some unlucky vole. Good or bad, normally she would stop to copy down such lines to ease them from her head onto the page. Making poems orders her thoughts, and writing them down keeps them from piling up. But she's got no paper or pen. Her notebook, along with her hoodie, is in the backpack she believes she's circling toward, not realizing she's a quarter mile from the path, that she's only aiming deeper into the bog. Bending, she reties the lace that keeps coming undone. While not hungry or cold enough yet to panic or wish, Cassie merely imagines being back at Banna's warm cabin, watching from the vantage point of a ceiling tile, scanning the rooms and halls as her family moves in and around them, some more slowly than others. Why do some people seem so old when they're not? Her mother isn't, only acts like it, crabby all weekend, as if her thong has ridden. And Gran Karina, who is not fat, wears plaid pants with elastic waists anyway, and hums. Banna, even with her face like bark, is 10 times more fun. Old as dirt, she says herself, tickled that she's lasted as long as she has. She was a beer truck driver once, and before that, worked in a munitions plant as a mechanic. Banna can fix any kind of engine, built her own log splitter, brews nasty beer, and could care less about Cassie's grades or what Cassie eats or wears or says or doesn't. Banna's own appearance is unintentionally amazing. Old dresses layered over long underwear, wrist warmers made out of long woolen tights, a crocheted beret perched on the long braids crimped around her skull like a pie crust, the perfect place to park a pencil or paper clips or fishing lures. Her cleated surplus boots cling with each step around the workshop. In winter, these outfits are always topped with a ratty fur coat and doe-skin choppers that hang from each sleeve by electrical wire so that she doesn't lose them. To the rest of her family, Banna is Gran Ursa because Ursa is her name. But when Cassie was a baby, Ursa fed her a jar of pureed bananas, which she immediately vomited back with precision. For the span of Cassie's toddlerhood, every sighting of Ursa incited her to scream, "Banna!" And so she has been ever since. In spite of their initial wariness, over the years, Cassie and Banna have developed a somewhat smug bond that excludes the rest of her family. The sort of winking alliance strangers might share when sneaking out of the same bad play. There's a tight corner in the workshop surrounded by shelves of motor oil and lithium grease and spray paint cans too rusty to read, where the two of them eat breakfast, smacking heads over the daily jumble before settling into the Times crossword. Banna's chair is near the propane ring where the kettle boils, and she can warm her knuckly hands. Individual hairs of her fur cuffs sparking and filling the air with the smell of charred otter. Cassie's mother and Gran Karina are not allowed in the workshop because there's a chance they might start cleaning. And with all the power tools and blades, it's too dangerous for the twins, so they have the place to themselves, unmolested, as Banna says. But this morning, Gran Karina had intercepted Cassie on the path to the workshop and put the bucket in her hand, pointing down the road and the ATV trail, telling her to gather alder cones and baby cattails for one of her gluey craft projects. "Yes, now," she had said, "and don't take too long." That was hours ago. Cassie thinks longingly of the sandwich in her backpack, rye and cheese, and the hard salami that Banna had slipped in, warning Cassie not to tell her mother Era, who is vegan. Her mother loves to lecture Banna about her diet, warning that her heart is probably a time bomb because of the sodium, as if she might go off at the table. But Banna is stubbornly never sick, in spite of living on ice cream and cured meats, usually undercooking things when she does rouse herself to light the stove. Her casual attitudes regarding refrigeration are alarming, but she's not ashamed of being a rotten cook in the way Gran Karina thinks she should be. No one suggests she starts baking. But Ara has hinted that Vanna might be a better grandmother if maybe she stopped acting like a weird uncle. Hints, always hints. No one ever dares say anything directly. It's true, Vanna doesn't make lemonade or like small children. But she will always drag Cassie along to chase whatever volunteer fire truck or ambulance is off to see where the accident is or what is burning. So it's not like they don't spend quality time. And she'll even teach Cassie something useful now and then, like after yesterday's unsuccessful swerve, when she demonstrated how to field dress a fender-dented fawn with only a leather man and an ice scraper. Stupid-ass Bambi, bloody fur on my bumper, pretty little lunch. So that's one of the many haikus that Cassie writes. I'd like to maybe read a little bit more about Ursa, who is another of my favorite characters. And she's 148. I hope to make this a discussion too, so questions will be more than appreciated. As I was telling somebody here earlier, the worst times in a writer's life are the moment between asking, "Are there any questions?" and the dead silence that follows. My friend Lorna Landvik tosses candy out to whoever will be brave enough to ask a question. I personally have beer coasters out in the hallway for whoever will. And so this is Vanna, who is in her 90s. A pry bar clutched in one hand, the other planted on her new hip. Ursa Olsen steps back to assess her handiwork, pleased by what she's been able to accomplish with only a few tools and indignation. Stripping her kitchen to the studs wasn't something she'd thought through. Simply, she began doing it, and when it became difficult or her limbs complained, she grabbed some lever or the Sawzall or the tube of Bengay. It began early, when she was supposed to be in town for physical therapy. She wasn't, because Kip Cariella was supposed to drive her and had called to say his car was making that same noise again. Ursa offered to limp the half-mile over to look under his hood, but Kip said, "Yeah, Ursa, that would kind of defeat the purpose, no, wouldn't it?" No matter. She could drive herself, having finally found the car keys in the flour canister where Karina had hidden them. Clever on Karina's part, Ursa had to admit, given the odds that she would ever bake anything. Her daughter was not usually clever. In fact, Karina was quite unformed in many ways, despite her age, despite being a card-carrying member of the AARP. Ursa settles behind the wheel. The Olds 88 isn't automatic. Her hip is nearly healed, and she rarely uses the brake anyway. But before she can even turn the key, a huge pickup coasts down the drive and stops in the loop, blocking her way. Its door is painted with a logo of a beaver clutching a handsaw perched on a mound of wood shavings. Ursa hoists herself out and waits until Larry Perla's son, what's his name, walks over with a clipboard and a tape measure. "Rob," he reminds her when she asks. Assuming Karina had called him about the dryer vent, Ursa leads him back to the house and gets busy making instant coffee. It's already after 8 and too late for the clinic anyway. She digs a donut from the depths of the bread box while the kettle boils. After walking all the way around the foundation, Rob bangs in and wipes his feet. She hears him set his tape measure down on the table. And when she turns, she sees he's also spread flat a set of blueprints. Ursa sighs, dummy. He'd meant to go to next door, where the old cabin like hers is being razed and being replaced with a new behemoth. She bangs the kettle back onto the hob. God damn it. Now I've missed my appointment because here you've stopped at the wrong place. I don't think so, Mrs. Olson. He holds his clipboard. You're fire number 3958. That's right, but you're still wrong. Ursa hands him a donut and claps powdered sugar from her hands. He pauses. Look, here's the work order for this house. What work order? She elbows in next to him. For the remodel. What remodel? He nods at the blueprints. This one. First, he points with the donut, since there's no place to set it, then slips it into a pocket of his Carhartt. He runs a sugary finger over the white lines of the blueprints, showing Ursa how existing rooms of this house will be expanded, how the thicker lines represent new rooms altogether. This house, you're certain? Yes, ma'am. See? He taps the corner where names were printed. Ray and Karina Olson. Karina, your daughter. Jesus wept, I know who she is. The vein near Ursa's temple thumps, reminding her she hadn't taken her Diavan. She leans over the prints and demands that Rob explain in detail. He does, tracing the blueprint as he speaks. The sunroom addition will poke out toward the lake like a glass ship. A new master suite with a his and hers bathroom added to the west side, along with a den for Ray and a sewing room for Karina. With a great room, kitchen, and mudroom, the expansion would bloat the house to 3 times its current size. Rob puffs up a little bit himself. 2,500 square feet. Oh, Ursa inhales slowly through her nose. He rolls the last blueprints away to reveal a colored rendering in glowing hues. The expanded house, along with the grounds, appears totally unreal and soft-edged, as if the artist had been drugged with mushrooms or was Thomas Kincaid. That color, she taps a grouping of flowering shrubs, does not exist at this latitude. So that's my character, Ursa Olson. Some of the questions that I get from people is Hatchet Inlet real? Yes and no. It is to me. Quite a few of you are familiar with northern Minnesota. Have any of you ever been to a resort in northern Minnesota? Can I see a show of hands? Yes. Part of in this book, in a way, is kind of a love story to the old mom and pop resorts that seem to be dying out, and there's so few of them left. I wanted to pay homage to the people who run them, the people that work in northern and rural Minnesota. My goal is to represent them. A lot gets written about northern Minnesota, about maybe the controversy or the mining or the beautiful places or the BWCA, but very little gets written about who these people actually are. The beer truck drivers and the workers and the miners. And those are the people that I grew up with. My grandmother had 10 children and raised them in Tower and Ely. So that was my summers were those summers, and those people were my people. And when I go up there now, I'm considered a 612er, as we all would be. But because I have a known name, I kind of have one foot in one realm and another foot in another. And when I was building my little cabin up there, one of the local contractors told me, make sure to put your name out on the road, because you have a recognizable name, you're less likely to be vandalized. So I did, and I never was vandalized. But that's the kind of place that it is. It's rural Minnesota, and it's very real. And my characters, one of the things that has been pointed out, not necessarily by me, but is that my children are not all above average, and my men are not all good looking. And I take that as a compliment, because this is not stereotypical Minnesota character, and I hope that it doesn't read as such. So the town of Hatchet Inlet, some of you might recognize it as Ely. So why am I writing this trilogy? And I never would have set out to do so, but as I said, I wasn't really quite finished with the people here. So I took 3 of them, Alpo Lottie, who is known as Edward, or called Alpo Scissorhands in this book. I wanted to talk a little bit more about him and his son Pete. And they have a very complicated relationship. So this father and son, who the father is a miner, and maybe I'll read just a tiny bit from, actually, does somebody have a copy of Laurentian Divide? I'd love to read the opening from that. So for a minute, you would have to, thank you so much. You would have to imagine that I am a 45-year-old pastor from the Iron Range. After a tragedy that takes place in this book, over the people then live the polar vortex winter, but just before that, there is this tragedy that is a car accident, and shortly thereafter, they're preparing for their winter and they're grieving, and their pastor has this to say to them. So I'm a 45-year-old pastor. What could Hatchet Inlet, here at the edge of the wilderness, have in common with 3rd century Rome? You might not know that the St. Lawrence River Divide that T-bones our own Laurentian Divide is named for a Roman. St. Lawrence was the archdeacon of Rome, where he held the purse strings as treasurer, a good man when Rome had its share of bad ones, like the Emperor Valerian. Think Darth Vader, only not too bright. Kicking Christians out of Rome wasn't enough for Valerian, so he decided to kill them. He sentenced Lawrence to death, but only after he ordered him to turn over the church's treasures. Lawrence stalled, claiming he'd need 3 days to pull the coffers together, since they were scattered all over Rome. But on the sly, he was doling out the treasure to the needy, all of it. Then he gathered his entourage, widows and peasants, lunatics and orphans, and presented them to Valerian as the true treasures of Rome. You can imagine the emperor was not amused, and he ordered Lawrence to be roasted on a spit. The story is, when he was half seared, he said, "Stick a fork in me, I'm done," or something like that. For his trouble, Lawrence was declared the patron saint of cooks and comedians. I chose Lawrence for today's sermon because he was an immigrant. He'd gone to Rome to do good work and find a better life. An immigrant, just like most all of our grandparents, like the Mexican boys working over at the pulp mill, like our own Cam down at the noodle place. And we all know Veshko here. We see the faces on the news every day. Refugees drowned by the boatload. Countries shutting their doors to those in need. Fools making noise about building walls. This is what we've come to. I want to think that here in Hatchet Inlet, we are better than that, because we have to be better than that. This congregation has suffered mighty blows, and we have plenty of healing ahead of us. Farmer's Almanac says this winter is going to be a doozy, people. And by the way, they're saying it again. Let's take these coming months to reflect, mourn, and pray. Spring will come, even on days like this, when it doesn't seem possible. Spring will come. In the meantime, if you see a stranger, welcome them. If you see someone is lonely, sit down and share a coffee. If you know someone in these families grieving or in pain, listen. Pull out your earbuds and just listen. Don't turn away. Make it a point to give of yourself, and it will come back to you in spades. Okay? One housekeeping item before we begin. I'd like to remind everyone that plows are out and odd side parking begins this evening. And now, without further ado, I invite the accordionists to approach the lectern from the left, and if the brass will line up on the right, we can get this show on the road. Go with God. Now let's polka. I'd love to open it up to questions and comments and make this more of a discussion. And I know I've bribed a few people to come up with some questions, so maybe we could just start. Yes, ma'am, you get a beer coaster. The question is, since my name up there was recognizable, why did I use a pen name for some of them? I decided after the last election that I needed to address a very specific audience, and that was women under 40 years old, very few of which are in this room right now, but a lot of them whom I am related to, who did not have to work in the same way that my generation or my mother's generation did for women's rights. And now that we see them being pulled out from under our feet, I realized I needed to adopt a nom de plume and be a character who is that age to address a reader of that age. And that's what I wrote Fishing with Rayanne as, which is about the first all-women's fishing talk show on public television. And this young woman is given this opportunity. She's very much an accidental host of this program, but she understands in getting it that she has a platform in which to further feminist goals and just be a feminist at the age of 35 or 40 years old. So that's why I did that. So thank you. Did that affect my sales? Yes, it did. And that book tanked. But I have written a series treatment for a television series treatment for it. And we'll see how that goes. And it is being reissued by the University of Minnesota Press coming this spring in March as Fishing. So we'll see. And that again, that's another trilogy. So it's Fishing, Reeling, and Leaping. Right now I'm finishing Reeling, which the show goes on the road, and it is a fishing talk show. The show goes on the road to New Zealand, where my niece, who was the inspiration for that book, lives. So I get to do that now. So yes. How does an author decide what languages the book gets translated to? And we don't get to decide that. That is decided by the agents who sell those translations. And so my first book, These Granite Islands, was much more popular in other countries than it ever was here. And that was partially because it was with a big publisher, Little Brown, out of New York. And they sold to 11 countries. And the book itself didn't get very much play here in Minnesota. And in fact, I was sent on book tour, leaving from St. Louis, Missouri, instead of St. Paul, Minnesota. So that was my big New York publisher. And they really kind of missed the boat because the Midwest is a great literary hub, and we are good readers here, and we have great booksellers. I also want to do a shout out to Lake Country Books, who are here. Are we still here? Yes. So thank you for coming. Yes. The question is about my book, The Ice Chorus, which is currently out of print, and It's set in Canada and Mexico, and it's about my sense of place. I did really want to break out of Minnesota and write about somewhere else. And so I went to Ireland to write this book, and ended up writing a book about Minnesota. It wasn't, you kind of almost have to get far enough away from your own environment to write about it, it seems to me. So I didn't write about Ireland until I came back here, but I did stay there for quite a while. I was at the Tyrone Guthrie Center, our own Tyrone Guthrie, who had, in County Monaghan, there's a beautiful writers residency program. And I was able to live there for 6 to 8 weeks, I guess, and work on that book. It's the only book that I have that's not set in Minnesota. I highly recommend it. I am hoping that my publisher, the University of Minnesota Press, will reissue it, possibly with my next title. And I would like to do a shout out to the University of Minnesota Press, as they are one of the best publishers in the country, and they keep more Minnesota authors in print than anyone else, hundreds and hundreds of titles, and all of those that, like Sigurd Olson and Helen Hoover and, all the classics, they never go out of print with the University of Minnesota Press, and so that's one of the reasons that I am with them now. Even though they can't really quite get me the sort of exposure that I would love to have, they are awesome. What is the incentive to write screenplay rather than novel? Well, money is a big motivator. But for me, I originally wrote Fishing with Rayanne as a screenplay, as an exercise to try to, because I was originally a visual artist. I came to writing quite late. I'm a late bloomer. I didn't publish my first book until I was 40 years old, but prior to that, I was a visual artist. And what I found that I was doing in writing was overwriting all of the descriptive and visual parts of my novels. And I would go in and probably take out a third of all of my descriptive stuff. And, lovely reviews say that, my work is very cinematic, and thank you very much. But I wanted to challenge myself and see what it was like to give up that part of my brain, more or less, and challenge myself to just write the dialogue and just write the scenes. So that's what I did. It has not been actually lucrative yet. I mean, I would love to make a living as a writer, but, that doesn't really happen unless you're a crime writer, which I am working on. Way in the back. Can I say anything about Watershed, the third in the trilogy, and what I'm doing with that? I'm researching it. I just finished, last summer I finished a residency at the St. Croix Watershed Research Station. I'm researching water in Minnesota, water as a commodity, water as it pertains to our environment, water as it pertains to industry. Right now I'm looking into Nestle selling water. Water is going to become a commodity in the state of Minnesota. And right now, one of the big battles in northern Minnesota is about mining, how that's going to affect that watershed, which is one of the most important watersheds in the country. And it literally may become our source of fresh water. The Midwest, southern Midwest was the breadbasket of America. The northern Minnesota could become the spigot. And we have the water. We have Lake Superior and we have the watershed. And so right now, of course, there's quite a few people who, it's a big battle right now. And so what I'm trying to do, and one of the things I'm trying to do in Watershed is just shine the light on that, what the future of water is in Minnesota. And as far as characters, I got really stuck on Alpo Lottie, who is one of the main characters in this one, Laurentian Divide. And I kind of fell in love with Alpo. And so I also wanted to go back to Finland with that book and talk about how we don't learn from history. And a little bit of the research I'm doing about Watershed as well is about the Finnish Civil War and how we historically don't learn that much about history, because the Finnish Civil War, it was one of the most brutal civil wars. Neighbors, the Reds and the Whites, and the way that they treated one another. And we kind of see this, history coming back at us again. So that's what I'm researching, and I'm hoping to go to Finland maybe next year and sending Alpo there in the way that oftentimes, this retired miner with a lot of time on his hands, what would he might become really interested in his background. And it is mentioned in this book that he had a great aunt who was involved in the resistance in the Finnish Civil War. So that's one of the things that I'm writing about. Thank you for asking that.
What do you do for an author bio?
When I publish a book under an assumed name, what do I do for an author bio? I actually created a character who wrote those books. And that was much easier than writing as myself. So Ava Finch was, much younger than I am. And she's got red hair, she drinks more, she has more sex, she swears, she has a lot more fun than I do. And she's single. So it was fun to write from the point of view of a character that's not me. It also made the writing go a lot faster. But as far as a bio goes, I just made some crap up. And at the time it was right around the 2016 election, so I made her Canadian because that's what I wished I was at the moment. And, you do what you do. So that was Ava Finch, and now she's gone. Dog rest her soul. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming. This was such a fabulous event, and thank you for supporting your friends group more than anything. So awesome.
Yes.